Hello and welcome to all the little history nerds out there. I'm Joe, here with me is my co-host Dan.
Hello and greetings.
And we've watched another Pillars of the Earth episode. This was fun. And this week on Pillars, we have the execution of Barthélemy. I was going to say Bartholomew, but I prefer Barthélemy because he was Normand. He was a Norman. We have Remigius trying to counter Philip when Philip counters with, labor is prayer, which I really like that quote. He's saying that labor is close to godliness, which was an actual, I think, medieval saying or something. J'adore cela. At the work site, we've got Marfa acting like Tom's deputy, which is pretty cool. And this is a role she kind of fulfills in the book and in the TV series, where she goes around being her dad's voice and eyes where necessary, because she knows what he wants and how to do all the work for the most part. Because if she inherited more of her dad's talent for stonework and carpentry than her brother. If only she was able to be apprenticed or something. But the problem was, given the time period, it was impossible because girl. That said, she would have probably been married off to a successful mason or master builder so that she could improve his skills and, he could become heir to Tom should anything happen, or at least found a distaff house of sorts. But peasants married for love, nobles for political advantage. That's generally how it worked in the medieval period. That said, we have the transformation of Kingsbridge into a market town being proposed by Philip, which is something that I really like that scene. We've got Marfa trying to tell Jack that she stole his ring, but she feels so bad, and he tells her love's not a contest, and she says, then how come it's a thing to be won or lost? I love that line. We also have, of course, the priest who stole from the stash of money that Barthélemy gave to him. Now, he's executed in front of his kids who agree to serve Etienne, which I could see that happening, but I'm also like, wow, where's filial piety here? In the medieval ages, they would have been suspected and mistrusted. And later, Etienne mistrusts them for good reasons, because he's like, yeah, he enslaves them, basically like, oh yeah, I fight all my battles, kill Henri Le Premier's children. But he's also like, I'm not giving you the earldom of Shire for the most part. He's like, I really can't give that to you. You basically supported the execution of your dad and then supported your dad's killer. I really don't trust you. Because, I loved my daddy. I love my son, or my sons, because he has two of them. And he's like, and you guys would happily, with a smile, serve your dad's killer? That's a little unethical. And who could argue with him? No, I would not. Honestly, I would trust William Hamley to an extent more than I would trust those two to an extent if I was a king, because I know the Hamleys are political animals. But in a civil war, you need brutes like them. On the other hand, Richard's a brute, but he's also happily serving his dad's killer. Filial piety must count for something. You must be loyal to at least one person, whether it's your father, your sister, your wife, your husband, whatever. Or your dog. You have to be loyal to at least one person in your life. And if you don't even have that small amount of loyalty, why should anyone trust you? And yeah, in the medieval period, this sense of filial piety and familyness was even more heightened. So he doesn't trust them with good reason. But like I said, it's because Etienne is a man who's feels his own loyalties very keenly, at least historically. And even in the show, he kind of feels it. So for him, the children of Barthélemy are just there's something off about them, which to an extent, yes, Aliena's a good person, and she is honorable to have sworn that oath to her dad, but willingly serving Etienne is a little, in Anglo-Danish culture, which you got to bear in mind, it was popular it was the main culture of England at the time, and in Normand culture, blood feuds were a thing. The fact that you'd go, yep, I'm with you. We should have a blood feud, but I'm not going to pursue it. You're always going to be watching your back around them. So, culturally, this is a moment where, weirdly, this is a bit of a form of vengeance against Etienne, because he's always going to be looking over his shoulder at them, frightened of them. But on the other hand, they are betraying their father. It's a direct betrayal of him and their oath to him, to an extent. And I know people may argue, but it's the reality. And because filial piety was everything. And yes, they have to try to get the earldom back, and that's the main goal. Even Barthélemy would agree with it. And he'd understand them serving with Etienne. He would. To an extent. But on the other hand, he'd think, serve Mathilde. You have to serve her. She's the lawful Lady of the English. And Duchess of Normandy. But, the main thing is get the earldom back. But the second thing is serve her. That second one, he'd be unsure about their loyalties to an extent. It would basically cause family division. That said, the quarrymen thing is an interesting and funny scene because you just have this blue-collar sense of humor. When can you start work? As soon as you pay us. All right, then that shouldn't be too hard. Oh, yeah, I guess not. But then they find at the quarry the Hamley forces led by William, which leads to a scuffle between Wyatt and Jack, which ends in Jack's broken arm. And Jack is the main sculptor of this the new statue of Saint Adolphus. And in turn, Jack ends up finishing the sculpture before the end of the episode, despite his broken arm. And the quarry is in Hamley hands until Philip gathers everyone, goes in the middle of the night, well, not in the middle of the night, just before the dawn, and counting on the rise of the sun at the exact hour, he holds the cross in front of him in a great scene and challenges William Hamley and actually wins the Battle of Wills, relying on William's superstitious nature and on time itself and just God. Like, there's no other way of putting it. And in the universe, I guess God pulls through for Philip.
He puts the fear of God in him.
Okay, that one was bad. But, you see my puns are bad. Etienne has a really Shakespearean, Macbethian, Hamlet type dream, which is, I love this scene. It's so Shakespearean.
Oh, I can't argue with that. It was a beautiful scene.
Yeah, seriously, this show does a great job. We have Aliena trying to sell wool, failing because, she's offered half price because she's a woman, and yeah, that would have happened back then. That totally would have happened. Now, in the post 1750s era, no, because merchants, a lot of seamstresses were women eventually, and it became, they could sell the same as men in a lot of cases. But in the era of the Normand, oh yeah, this is how it would have happened. And we have Philip buying it and then giving the chunk of money that belongs to Aliena to her out of respect and honor. And then he begs for her forgiveness because he was the one who told the Hamleys to take care of them taken care of, as the Italians might say. But he was thinking the Hamleys would genuinely take care of Aliena and Richard. He was naive. And Aliena forgives him. And later she shows up for, to visit the church on a very special day, the day of St. Adolphus. The king is counseled to go to the cathedral, or at least the site of it that would be the future cathedral. In the novel, it's Henri de Blois, the bishop, who was an early ally of Philip and later semi-enemy, but then back to being an ally. It happens. And in turn, this information is tipped off to Jack when he went to go visit with some ladies of the evening. And after spending some time with them, including drawing one of them, and it's implied, well, he overhears a conversation between Percy Hamley and Percy's men and discovers that the king's due for a trip. So he ends up telling Philip, and Philip gives a beautiful speech to the villagers of a nearby village about the cathedral being not simply God's home on earth, but also the home of hope on earth. That to look inside is to see beauty, to see everything, the rawest form of humanity in a way. And hope itself, given physical manifest form. This is called concretization, but at least Joseph Campbell coined the phrase and really hammered it home, in that this is an important aspect of humanity. We need to give physical shape to our faith. Otherwise, we don't genuinely believe. And this concretization is giving physical shape to our religion and our culture. It's more than just religion, it's culture in practice. And that every culture practices this. Every culture, since the dawn of man, have all practiced this. And that every culture that does it is in fairly healthy shape. Doing this is a very natural thing. Whether it's essentially a church to democracy, a church to God, or Amun-Re, or the Temple of Uppsala to Odin, or whatever, they have all done this. And concretization always leads generally to beauty. And it is also typically creating a site of pilgrimage. And thus you have a market that's born, and you have a society that begins to thrive. And I'm just going to give a small scolding to a lot of our modern cultures. We don't do that because we're in decline. And I know people may say, no, we're not. Yes, we are. We have not done concretization in a long time. There are still some cultures that do it today, and they're usually a little healthier than some of ours. And some of those around. But the thing is, a lot of our cultures don't do that. But I suspect that the time for concretization is going to make a resurgence soon. It's going to come back as healthier societies are born and healthier cultures take root and whatnot. Or certain cultures start to renew themselves and resuscitate. A good example would be Japan. They're still building temples to an extent. They're still practicing concretization of their faiths, which is a very healthy practice. It shows a culture in bloom. At least that's what I've observed. I think France is actually getting resuscitated. The Notre Dame was burnt down. That's a terrible blow to us French. We all cried when we found out the news. At least you and I did. We wept. But it's being rebuilt greater and better than before, which that is a concretization, not simply of faith, but of French culture. So you see, this sort of practice is a natural process. And that is what this story is all about. That aside, enough of my preaching, I guess. The progress is shown to the king, and about a few thousand people show up for this day to work in return for plenary indulgences. And Johnny Eightpence is the first one to spot these people coming before the king. And, this gives a lot of hope. But Tom and Philip have a bit of a panic attack at the thought of the baby being that high, Jonathan, the baby of Tom. And they're like, get him down from there. Philip knows it's Tom's baby. And essentially, Philip feels like a father to Jonathan. Johnny feels like a mother or a father to Jonathan. Tom feels like basically it's three daddies and one kid. And one mommy and Helen. But this scene is really good. And of course, we've got Etienne's visit to the site. He gives his blessings and says he can't wait to see it again before a messenger arrives to inform him that, well, Mathilde has taken Lincoln after she took an arrow through her armor when she shouldn't have been near the battlefield, and Etienne basically has a seizure. That said, the entire incident about Mathilde getting an arrow, I think that's probably a reference to Jeanne d'Arc, and that didn't happen. But it's a great artistic nod to Jeanne d'Arc, and that was a great incident in Jeanne d'Arc's history, so I don't mind that. I consider it more homage being paid to a historical figure later on, and you know what? It's okay for you to do that with female characters in fiction because it adds drama, and it is conveying a certain amount of saintliness of the character to the audience. And though Mathilde historically, early in her career, was a little cold, I'm going to be polite. She was not exactly an okay lady. The idea of saintliness when connected to a monarch is a very, very, very old idea, and it's part of the king or queen archetype. Basically, the king's healing touch of scrofula is a very common trope. Or healing leprosy, very, very common. Aragorn, for example, is the classic healing monarch and priestly king. For Mathilde to basically be portrayed that way is natural. This show is taking Mathilde's side when it comes to claiming the throne of England. And you know what? She was the legitimate queen or empress or whatever of England because her cousin usurped the throne. Everyone swore an oath to her that she would be queen. And you know what? The thing about England was it did not have a loi salique that said women cannot inherit like in France. France had the law since 482, I think, since 482 or so, since Clovis, maybe even before. So in France, could a woman inherit the crown? Never. It'll never happen because it just doesn't work. That's France. But England is a different animal. Same with Scotland. So you have different laws. The Normans may have brought a lot of their legal structures to England, but Henry basically stated, okay, that law we don't bring over. We are not exactly French. We're also part Danish, which, yes, they were. So he said, I'm going to favor the Danish side of the inheritance laws in that regard. Women can't inherit a crown like that. So, okay, because, you know, the practice of a woman inheriting the crown of a crown, at least in England, or at least of a lesser kingdom in England, in the case of Aethelswith, I think it was, the Lady of Mercia, she inherited it from her husband. So there was a legal precedent in England. But the thing is, Henry was relying on that and said, yes, you know, this is the law. I want to favor the English kind of laws over the Norman. Well, not the Norman, but the French. So Frankish law was essentially thrown out in that regard, which this was something that he ran by not the three estates, but kind of the precursor to them, and basically ran it by all the barons and clergy and said, what do you guys think? I don't want loi salique. I don't want the Salic law here. And they all said, okay, sure. So, and there was also, most importantly, David, who said, yeah. Bear in mind, he was the most powerful vassal as Earl of, I think, Northumbria. So, and Earl of Huntingdon. So, yeah. All the vassals, all the religious people said, sure. So, England then deviated from France, got her own laws. Laws that are more similar to Scotland, which female inheritance was always a possibility in Scotland to an extent. So in that regard, I'm just saying, I know this is a long-winded explanation, but this is how it worked with England. So Mathilde actually has the claim. I don't know where, but even if you say, no, it should be a male relative. Okay, but Etienne would only inherit through his mother. Therefore, both Mathilde and Etienne would be illegitimate. Yeah. So, which do you prefer? The daughter or the sister's son? Honestly, given that they all swore an oath and that she actually served as a bit of an apprenticeship to Heinrich IV of the Holy Roman Empire, a very powerful monarch, one of the best in Europe. She served as a political apprenticeship under him, then went to work with her husband, who was a very competent individual, and under her father-in-law, another very competent individual, and learned from Henry. On top of that, she has pretty good ties with the French monarchy, so the Capet line, and she's on relatively good terms with David. Honestly, if I was a baron, I'd say, yeah, she's actually the legitimate queen.
By law, by succession, by everything.
By oath, everything.
And looking at it that way, Etienne was an usurper.
Yeah, nice guy, but a terrible usurper. I know she was not exactly the best person early in life, but you know what? It doesn't mean what Etienne did was right. Now later, you got to bear in mind, like I said, he seemed like he was a nice guy. He was very gentle, and that gentility was the problem with his reign. Anyways, I know I'm basically saying this is a very complex issue, because it is. And judging it is a nightmare. Like, because you have Etienne, who's a really nice guy, but not a good king. You have Mathilde, who's not a great queen, and not the best person. She's flighty and unreliable and haughty early in life. And she has that temper, that Angevin temper. But she does have the legal right. Like, if you flout this law, the inheritance law, you have to flout every law. Like, it's just, yeah.
Etienne, the only way he'd probably be able to inherit is probably through an aspect of French law.
But even then, he's disinherited by that French law. So, yeah.
And these are the only two people who could pretty much legitimately inherit.
Well, actually, Etienne has an older brother. So he's usurping also his older brother. So, yeah.
It would have to go to the older brother.
But so Etienne usurped his older brother and Mathilde.
And if the older brother said, yeah, I'm supporting Mathilde.
Well, the older brother, I think, ended up supporting Etienne against her, fearful that the family might lose their newly gained crown. But the trouble was, didn't prove enough. And yeah, we could do an entire podcast just about the events that were taking place throughout France and England at this time in Scotland. Maybe we should at some point.
Yeah.
But the problem is, I feel like we'd have to kind of start in the age of the MacAlpins, almost 200 years before, just so that people understand, like, who everyone is and understand the entire history and whatnot. I think we might have to do that. Start with the MacAlpins and the Rebeltiens, the Capets ancestors, and the Normands, like basically the ancestors of Mathilde. Start with the ancestors of these three dynasties and just trace their line forward. Maybe we'll do that soon. Tell us in the comments section. It'd be a very long-winded podcast, and we'd have to do a lot of research, but we might have to do that at some point. So it'll help people.
It'd be interesting.
Yeah, very much so. Tell us what you think in the comments section. Don't forget to smash that like. Oh, right. We also have to rate this episode. I'm going to say it's a 3.5.
Yeah, 3 3/4.
Okay. Don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button.